Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our services, if we can please kindly turn off all cell phones or electronic devices, or please place them on silent. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. A loving father to his 4 daughters, a husband of 66 plus years to Nyla, proud and committed grandfather, sibling, son, cousin, talented and celebrated surgeon, a lifer in this area, and most recently, the proud great-grandfather to Avery, and so much more. Now, I didn't know Dr. Phillip Aronow in life, but I had the honor of spending time yesterday with his wife, with his children, and some of his grandchildren who effusively shared stories with me about the man that Phil was. They raised up and shared about his demeanor. Speaking of Avery, yeah? Right. Yep. They shared with me about his demeanor, his kindness, his sense of loyalty to those in his circle and even those somewhat outside his circle, about his non-confrontational nature, and how when he spoke, and I'm sure you all know this, he spoke with gravitas. You'll hear shortly from a number of members of this family who'll share more about the man that he was for them and for many tentacles of this large and connected family, because he was, as the word that they used was, he was a patriarch of this family. When I finished my meeting with the family, I couldn't help but be moved. I walked in as a stranger, but I was moved by the amount of love and respect in the room spanning generations. It's not something that I see every time I meet with a family so clearly, but I felt it for Phil, and I felt it also for you, Nyla. I learned that Nyla is the queen mom, and that remains the same now. So, if I may, a word to you, Nyla. We know that this death weighs heavily for you, since you were married and so deeply connected for so many decades, for so long. Your children and your grandchildren stand by you to support you as we mark this transition and as you move through the stages of grief. It's my prayer that you lean on those supports and feel truly in your heart and in your soul the love that surrounds you in this moment. Our Jewish tradition teaches that while the physical body's temporary, the soul is eternal. So today, we gather for sacred purpose, to pray for full and complete rest for Phil's body, and we know that it had been a challenging couple of years for him. Yet, I'll note I saw a photo of him from just a few days before he died. It was the day before, the day before, with a big smile on his face. So we focus on the fact that Phil's soul, even in death, remains bound to the bond of life, which is to each of you, and we offer blessings for the continued elevation of his soul. May our time together today have purpose and deep meaning, and may it honor well Phil's memory, who passed away this past Saturday down in his other home in Key West. My name's Rabbi Nathan Weiner. I'm the Director of Jewish Outreach and Engagement for the Jewish Federation of Southern New Jersey and its family of agencies. It's truly an honor on behalf of myself, of my family, the Federation system, and the Jewish people, to be present here with you today. So for most of our time together, we keep our kavanah, our intention, on Phil's memory. Closer to the conclusion, graveside at Crescent Memorial Park will transition to supporting the mourners upon the recitation of the mourners' Kaddish. We also note that while this chapel is full of love and support from those present, there are also so many who are joining us virtually on the stream. Hi, and welcome. We offer words of welcome to you as well. Please know that your presence is additionally felt here in this chapel. As I mentioned, today we celebrate the life and mourn the death of Dr. Phillip Z. Aronow, Paltiel ben Eliyahu HaKohen Veriva. He is predeceased by his siblings, his brother Martin and his sister Clara, his cousin Stella, all of blessed memory. He's survived by his loving wife, Nyla, and his daughters, Victoria and her husband Marshall, Brett and her husband Keith, Bethany and her husband Bob, and Kerith and her husband Saul. His grandchildren, Rebecca and her husband Corey, Harris, Haddon, Griffin, Baxter, Quincy and her fiancé Jeff, Mazel Tov on your engagement, Ethan, Allery, Manning, Amelia, and Toby. And of course, as I've also mentioned, his great-granddaughter Avery. I pray I got every name correct. Okay, good. May your love and support for one another, God willing, carry you through this loss and this transition. Going to now recite Psalm 23, a psalm universal across the Abrahamic faith traditions at moments of grief and loss. I'll read it first in the Hebrew, followed by reading a standard translation in the English. If you're comfortable and would like to in either language, you're welcome to recite it with me. Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai ro'i lo achsar, bin oteshe yarbitzeni al mei menuchoti nahaleni, nafshi yeshovev yancheni b'maglei tzedek leman shemo, gam ki elech b'getz al mavet lo irara ki atay madi, shivtecha umishantecha hema yenachamuni, ta'aroch lafanai shulcha neged zorarai, dishanta v'shemen roshi kosi revaya, ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni kol yemei chayai, v'shavti b'veit Adonai le'orech yamim. A Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen v'amen. From Kohelet, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, for everything there is a season, a time for every experience under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what has been planted, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time for silence and a time for speaking. Now is a time for speaking, as a number of members of the family have prepared words in hesped, in eulogy of their beloved Phil, their husband, father, grandfather. So I'm going to call up folks in small groups, beginning with Nyla and Bethany and Ethan to share some words.
Thank you all so much for coming. Before there was Dr. Aronow, before he was Daddy, and certainly before he was Granddad, he was just Phil Aronow, a tall, skinny ninth grader who I had a crush on. And there's actually at least one person in this room who knew him then. I was in 8th grade. I'd seen him in the halls with a bunch of other tall, skinny guys, but I really got to know him at lunchtime in the guidance office. The guidance counselor at Hatch Junior High School was our neighbor, and she somehow got me excused from my English class for a half hour every day so I could mind the guidance office while she went to lunch. It was a good deal all around. And it got a lot better when that same bunch of boys started wandering into the office for the last part of their lunch hour. One of them I knew because my girlfriend already had a crush on him. 2 of the boys were not in the running. But that last guy, Phil Aronow, he was tall, he was smart, and he seemed very crush-worthy. So when I had to ask a date to take me to a hayride, I got my courage together, and I asked him, and he said yes. And I remember even more clearly, 2 days later, how my heart fell when he told me he couldn't go after all. He had to go to New York with his parents to visit relatives. But I was undaunted in my crush. I cut out pictures of athletes who looked like him and put them in my wallet. I wrote Phil with hearts and arrows and wrote them in all my notebooks. I knew that next to science, tennis was his passion. The tennis courts were at the end of my street, and I sat out on our front steps a lot, just in case he rode by on his bicycle. I knew that. Okay, but after a while, there were other boys asking me out, and it was time to move on. I'd see Phil around school, and we'd talk sometime, but I'd always listen with a special ear when I heard his name. When our teacher announced that there would be no biology prize this year because last year's winner, Phil Aronow, was so good, and she couldn't bring herself to give any of us the prize. And when our English teacher explained that the research for our term paper should be strong enough to teach her things she didn't already know, like Phillip Aronow's paper last year on DNA. I was delighted when I heard that he'd won a trip by plane to the United Nations in New York City and the coveted Bausch and Lomb Science Award at graduation. He signed my yearbook, and I signed his. I had held my breath as he took the stage for our school's most prestigious competition. And I hate to say this, because one of the other competitors was sitting in the audience. Right now is here. But I was sitting in the audience, but when the competition was going on, I was so worried that Phil would forget his lines. And I held my breath on graduation night as the principal announced, and the winner is Phillip Aronow. I ran into Phil once or twice during our college years, and we had moved on. He had a girlfriend. I was engaged for a while and then unengaged. At the end of June in 1956, a guy I'd been dating at college came down to Camden and had just left after a really lousy weekend. And now, what was I going to do for the evening ahead? So I went over to my friend Edda's house, and we were sitting on her front steps when we saw 2 tall, skinny guys walking down the street. And it was her crush and my crush. And I thought, oh my God, I'm back in 8th grade again. You want to go for a walk with us, they said? And we said, sure. And for a split second, I wasn't sure who was going to walk with whom. But then Phil and I started to walk together and catch up on the years since we had seen each other. A few days later, a voice on the phone said, "Hi, it's Phil. Would you want to go sailing with me this Saturday?" And I said, "Sure, sounds like fun." And it was fun. Fun enough to last for the next 67 years.
Do you want to go back to your seat? Or should I Ethan to walk you down? Or do you want to stay here?
Right here.
Okay. I'm next. I'm Bethany, daughter number 3, so we're going out of order today. What? Closer to the mic? Oh, is that better? Okay. So I was lucky to have been the daughter with the medical connection to my dad. I really found the way that we bonded professionally with each other had deepened over the years. We had a special understanding of each other and of living a life with a career in medicine. This meant handling medical issues or difficult cases, be it surgical or other weirdomas, but also meant handling some of the crazy patients, including my sisters, and we used to talk about you. Unlike the typical teenager, I never had a period of time where I thought my dad was stupid or out of touch, but he wasn't the typical dad. From early on, I understood completely that he was wise, yet soft-spoken. He was a man of few words, lots of ums, but very profound. Our house was the 24-hour minute clinic well before these ever existed. I remember the neighboring children coming over for help from my dad. We are no longer sure whether the green pea was in the nose or the ear. I say ear. But my dad graciously and competently removed the pea, the stone, or sutured the wound, be it human or stuffed animal. During my years before medical school, when I worked in the emergency room, I loved to be his assistant when he was called to see a patient there. You could just tell how well respected he was by everyone all over the hospital. I was also lucky enough to get to operate with him before I was anything really medical. One surgery I remember, the nurse commenting about all the abdominal adhesions. I didn't really understand the surgical implications then, as I would later on. But when the OR nurse said to me, if anyone else but your dad was operating, there would be multiple bowel lacerations at this point. When you graduate from medical school, instead of the dean of the college, you can have a family member, a medical doctor, hood you. I was lucky enough to have my father. And as much as it meant to me to have him, I think he was even more honored and excited to do it. Not everyone has family members in their same profession. I always thought it was rewarding to commiserate about the challenging cases, but also to celebrate the gratification and fulfillment of a great catch or a job well done for the patient. Over the years, I would lean on my dad for surgical consults when I was looking for a second opinion regarding my own patients. I know I called him more often than he called me, but I loved it when he turned to me for my GYN experience. My dad was the chief of the Department of Surgery and the chair of the medical staff at a time when these were volunteer positions. He took this on with pride and knowledge of the duty to serve his medical community. Again, I am now understanding the importance of him in this role as I start to take on similar roles. Growing up, I loved the sound of the name Dr. Aronow. He was, and so am I.
Thank you all for being here today. My name is Ethan. I'm the grandson of Phil, but to many of us, granddad. Today I want to share some words about Granddad's impact on anyone lucky enough to meet him. While Granddad's professional accomplishments speak for themselves, the impression he left on others speaks louder. Granddad had a heart that overflowed with compassion and kindness, which he shared with friends, family, and everyone around him. His smile lit up the room. As many of you know, Granddad was not afraid to shed a tear, even for the smallest joys or sorrows. Whether it was attending everyone's high school or college graduations, watching his kids and grandkids advance in their careers, or even just watching a moving story on MSNBC, his tears served as a reminder of his capacity to love deeply and wholeheartedly. As a kid, I remember driving down to New Jersey to build the Pinewood Derby race cars for the Cub Scouts in his workshop, where we carved out a miniature race car out of a block of wood. It was like he had an entire hardware store in just one small garage. Although the cars we built never won any of the races, I'll never forget the memories we shared working together. The experience I gained watching him approach a project and learning from his wisdom was far more valuable than ever winning a trophy. Granddad's legacy of compassion, empathy, and authenticity will live with us all forever. While many of us are crying today because we miss him, let this be a reminder that we can also cry happy tears, remembering all the amazing memories we were lucky enough to share with Granddad. Thank you.
We're now going to hear from Amelia, Rebecca, and Baxter.
Hi, I'm Amelia. I'm grandchild number 9, daughter of Kareth. Granddad loved tradition, but not always of the traditional variety. He never had a really religious education, but he loved to lead his Passover Seder. When they were little, his daughters, my mother and aunts, would come home from Hebrew school with their highlighted passages from their Haggadot to show him what to read. Even as he led the Seder, Granddad constantly deferred to him, and as a result, I grew up with Passovers that were led by Granddad, Queen Mum, and each of their daughters. And I thought that's just how Passovers were in a large family. Granddad would tell us what page to turn to, and then my mother and aunts would start to sing. I was given to understand throughout my life that Granddad was not observant, but it was obvious to anyone who came to his Seders how much he cared about honoring and bringing together his family and his community. He participated in and led the ritual because he loved the tradition and he loved seeing his family together singing. When I was about 12, I decided to write a little song to add to our Passover. It was a spoof of sorts of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, where the word hallelujah in the refrain of the song was substituted out for the word afikomen, which is my favorite part of Passover. It was sardonic and silly, and somewhere between religious and heretical. But most importantly, it was way, way too long. But when Granddad heard the song, he bawled his eyes out for all 5 minutes, and I mean 5 minutes of this song. And so the next year, we kept it in. We cut it to 3 minutes, but we kept it. And he bawled his eyes out again for the whole 3 minutes, and the next year it was 2, and he bawled for the whole 2. And every subsequent year, for the last 10 years that we've had Passovers with Granddad, he has cried and cried through this song. I've always thought about why he cried at afikomen. I believe it's because the song spoke to his combination of religious ambivalence and love of family tradition. As we sang it together, the family freely acknowledged and owned, as a family, I think, a tension that Granddad strongly felt. We were a large family unit. We are a large family unit, an Aronow-sized family unit, happily full of sentimentality and contradictions and love. And I think that's why Granddad cried.
This makes me feel really tall, and I'm not tall. I'm Rebecca. I'm the first granddaughter. I'm number 1 o'clock, which I'm kind of surprised no one else has brought up the clock, but it's fine. Last month in Key West, Granddad motioned me over to the couch to sit with him. I perched on the edge, and he took my hand to put on his heart. I teased that this was the same move I did to calm down Avery, and he smiled and closed his eyes and his hand over mine. Watching him sleep with breathing ragged, I sat there thinking about how much he wanted to be near me. I don't consider myself to be a calming presence to anyone generally. Maybe Avery. But in that moment, I was. And looking back on it, it was our goodbye. His farewell to his first granddaughter, named after his mother. Granddad was as loving as he was judging. He was smart as he was stubborn, and quiet as his family was loud and gregarious. You can see me or really anyone in the first row if you would like a very detailed, oriented, windy story about chicken, if you would like. And for 35 years, he was a part of my life. When I was young, he taught me to do the tip on a bill, and he tried to teach me about math and magnets, but that was more on the student than the teacher. He took me sailing in Long Beach Island and character searching at Disney World, while I tried to actively avoid them. And he called me on my bluff. Rebecca, there's something we need to talk about. Is it about Minnie Mouse? I was 4, so it was a lot cuter. He sent me books for Valentine's Day, and I still cherish my set of Jane Austen books. He let me sit on his lap at the opera so I could see anything besides the conductor's head. He really thought I should brush my hair and eat the crust from the bread, not just the chewy middle. When I was older, he believed me when I was an overconfident 12-year-old that said she knew where we were going in San Francisco and that I should follow him. He climbed the 5 flights of stairs to my La Boheme Parisian apartment when he probably shouldn't have. He was Team Hillary, Team Planned Parenthood, and Team Rachel Maddow, much to Quimum's chagrin. He knew all the answers to the New York Times news quiz and led us often to a perfect score. He was a stable fixture in my life, so much so that all these snapshots are snippets of the fact that he was always on my dad list. Friends from any stage of my life know that Quimum and Granddad are such a perfect part of who I am and how happy I am to be with them, how important they are as parents to me, and how grateful I am for their unwavering presence, love, and support. Most recently, his whole face lit up when he was with Avery. He knew how to speak her language by sticking out his tongue to mirror hers. Avery is very lucky to have visited her great-grandfather twice, especially on our last visit to Key West. I look forward to telling her that in the future. I love you, Granddad. Thanks for being the best.
Hey everyone. Okay. I'm Baxter. I am the 3rd grandchild, 3rd on the clock. So, Granddad modeled for his grandkids what it meant to be curious about the world around us, and at the same time, staying loyal and committed to his community here in South Jersey. He was deeply rooted, yet he was always learning and always teaching. Granddad spent nearly 9 decades around here in South Jersey and Philadelphia areas. Growing up, I was one of many cousins who got to spend holidays and birthdays around the house in Haddonfield, experiencing the chaos and the energy of a large extended family all in one place. Visits to Haddonfield with Granddad were a blend of the stereotypical as well as the unexpected. Of course, we'd hit up the typical spots like the Franklin Institute, the Heart exhibit, and the Rocky Steps, and the museum that goes with them. And there was always a Phillies game around playing in the background at the house. But Granddad was no typical Philly fan. Despite rooting for a team with a crazy green mascot called the Fanatic, known for wild antics, his outlook, as you all know, was always realistic and his demeanor was calm. What Granddad lacked in fanaticism, he definitely made up for in nostalgia. When I was in high school, he took me around to his alma mater, UPenn, when, of course, the memories of his time there had flooded back and had him crying within the first few steps on campus. Happy crying, as you've heard from previous speeches, but crying nonetheless. Even after my family moved away from our house in Connecticut, Granddad and Haddonfield remained constants in our lives. His house wasn't just a place to visit, but it was a second home, a source of stability and familiarity that spanned for decades. And being with Granddad meant learning, whether or not we were ready for the lesson. Later in his life, I enjoyed even absorbing new information secondhand from him, from his books on tapes, long after he would fall asleep for a nap. From history and physics to politics and biology, he wove it all into our time together, turning mundane moments on the couch or around the kitchen table into memorable lessons. Even when dozens of people were together under one roof, Granddad could make you feel like you were the only person in the room. So, in a city known for its passionate fans and larger-than-life personalities, Granddad stood out for his quiet strength, gentle spirit, and the way he could transform everyday moments into lasting knowledge. His memory will continue to inspire us to stay curious, stay committed, and make the most of all the time we have together. Thank you.
And lastly, Brett, Kareth, and Victoria.
Hi, I'm Brett, daughter number 2. When I was growing up, I rarely saw my dad. He worked really hard. Surgery started early in the morning, and when he was around, we knew his beeper could go off at any minute. Sometimes, when he volunteered for carpool duty, we'd be sitting in the parking lot of Hebrew school in the dark with neighbors, and he'd show up and say, "Wow, they sure clear out of here fast." What I do remember is that he'd always be there for Sunday brunch with bagels, lox, our grandparents, and the New York Times. In addition to family meals, I think our vacations were the times when we could be really fully together as a family. As we grew older and grew busy with our own families, my mom and dad lured us in. They'd rent a big house somewhere and then make the most of the time they could get with us. Long Beach Island, for many years, was a summer escape of choice. Our house was always crammed with dozens of people over the years, evolving from friends to boyfriends to fiancés to husbands, and eventually lots of grandchildren over the decade. While my dad could never keep the friends and the suitors' names straight, he was always welcoming. One favorite after tradition was called the name game. Dad never wanted to officially play, but somehow piped in for either team whenever he knew the answer. Key West became his happy place for more than the last 10 years. The condo was small, so we took turns coming to visit, but the view was spectacular. He ate at his favorite restaurants often, he watched the sailboats and big ships go by, and of course enjoyed the sunset parties. And he entertained all his grandkids, and this year his first great-granddaughter. He could not have had a better winter. I'm currently living in Africa and flew into Key West just last week, to be with my mom and dad, and my son and daughter, and her fiance. He was so happy to be with us, and he told me so.
I'm Kareth. We're messing up our order just to screw with all of you. I'm the youngest. Last May, I got a call from my dad. This was surprising itself because my dad couldn't talk very well after a stroke, and he couldn't see very well to dial the phone. But he somehow managed, almost certainly, by the way, with the help of either Susan or Robin or Larry, who were the most generous, helpful people for my dad and my mom, and we'd like to thank you all three of you. But he somehow managed to, whoever helped him, he dialed the phone and called me by himself. He labored to pronounce the words necessary to explain that he had an idea. He had read in the paper that after recent torrential rains in California, gold nuggets were loosened from the earth and apparently running freely. There was a new gold rush. My dad's idea was to buy some of that raw, unearthed gold and to create a pendant from it for my mom. He needed me to execute his idea, and he needed me to do it as soon as possible. It was as if his big heart was bursting, needing to express himself to my mom when words were so hard for him to get out. My dad was always running on a full tank of his own feelings and empathy for others. So many people have said some version of this in the last few days. What a good man my dad was. What a great soul. My favorite came from my friend since second grade, Elisa Camasholi. She told me that her father always referred to my father as a bonaccione. She explained it's buono, good, kind-hearted, with the suffix one, which, once together, makes the complement giant-sized. The good, kind-hearted one. I love this. As my daughter Amelia pointed out, he wasn't just interested in being good. He was compelled to do good. That sort of came with the job as a surgeon, but he found a way at 78 years old to keep it going in a second medical endeavor. My dad got credentialed to treat patients for opioid addiction. He was passionate about the culpability of drug companies, which he experienced firsthand as pressure to write big prescriptions for postoperative pain management. He was angry on behalf of his patients and excited to be part of a new, more humane and medical approach to treat addiction. This, of course, in addition to remaining on call 24/7 for all his friends and family who needed medical advice. To the last weeks of his life, he was answering calls. My dad also had a special appreciation and empathy with his grandchildren. He saw elements of himself in their faces, and more importantly, their souls. And he believed with his big heart that things would work out really well for all of them, just as happily as it had for him.
I've got final close. Trees, trees, trees. Haddonfield's football team used to play their games on Saturdays. Despite the fact that Daddy was always working, by the time I walked home those fall football afternoons, he would be in the yard raking mountains of leaves. To a teenager, those leaf mountains looked like the Himalayas, and as an immature kid, the opportunity to help him rake and spend quality time with him felt more like cruel and unusual punishment. But to only eulogize him for being a good doctor and a good dad is to miss how truly Jeffersonian he was. There was very little limit to the things he liked to learn and to do. And since he had a logical, analytical, and scientific mind, you would have to infer that when he and Mom bid on the house on Lucroft 51 years ago, he would have had to have known there would be massive and major leaf-raking duties in his future. 51 years in the same house is a long time, And in 51 years, those trees have grown a lot. Once, I remember my granddad bonking my dad's Mercury whatever car into a tree as he tried to be helpful and move the cars around the driveway. My dad didn't say a word to his father, but he gave him the raised eyebrow and the head tilt look. In the days long before there were backup cameras, we all bonked the cars into the trees, backing out of the driveway. Finally, Daddy took out 2 trees to save some fenders and some taillights. Who knew Scrapey Scrapey was so generational? One Thanksgiving, Brett brought home a college boyfriend who actually liked to be outside and rake leaves. I pointed this time because that day Daddy, who never had any boys till the grandsons came, must have especially realized a household full of 1 wife and 4 girls, wonderful as it was, did not and does not hold a candle to a college boy who liked leaf raking duties. That kid stayed out with Daddy until it was long, dark, and pretty cold. They filled an entire wire circle of leaves together. That boyfriend wasn't a keeper, but that story became family legend. He also loved to garden, and in our house he designed a greenhouse roof for the kitchen addition. Remember, he was an engineer too. In my mind's eye, I can see Daddy and the architect hovering over the plans in the old kitchen, and Daddy telling Mr. Van Uffel what he wanted, how to design it, and how to build it. The voluminous kitchen plants and mini trees at times were a little jungly, and all were very well loved by Daddy, despite the fact that he could be a little messy, okay, a lot messy, with his watering. On more than one occasion, Queen Mum chastised him for his wet and muddy puddles and reminded him that there were no scrub nurses home to clean up his messes. He grew beautiful orchids by first winterizing the bulbs and placing them on the cold, dark steps to the attic. He grew summer veggies on a community plot on Knalltop. When Haddon showed an interest in agricultural studies, I remember thinking, who studies that? But of course, Daddy knew all about soil science and plant genetics. DNA was one of his all-time favorite topics. In the last few years, as he hit milestone birthdays in his 80s and struggled with health issues, there were 2 instances of violent weather, and 2 different occasions where enormous, and I mean enormous, trees crashed into the backyard. Perhaps miraculously, no one was injured and the property damage was fixable. He did, however, give me the raised eyebrow and the head tilt when we talked about it, and that time a very expressive phew. My last conversation with him, literally a few hours before he died, was about transplanting trees. I bragged that a 434 Lou Croft red maple, complete with a few Pachysandra, which had first traveled by plane in a small red solo cup, and which had recently been replanted by Harris in Marietta, was leafing out. And in the last phone call, I told him 2 of the many, many apple trees that Haddon and I started from eating plain old supermarket apples and planting the seeds are bushing out with 2024 leaves. I was thrilled to tell him, and I think he was pleased to hear it. Because that's the point. He loved his trees. Thank you.
It's with all these thoughts, memories, and dedications in mind that we move to the central prayer of a Jewish memorial service, El Malei Rachamim, which asks that as Phil's to be laid to rest shortly at Crescent Memorial Park, that his soul be granted true rest on the wings of God's divine presence. I'll read it first in the English, followed by chanting it in the Hebrew. If you're physically able, I invite you to please rise. O God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant true rest upon the wings of God's divine presence in the exalted spheres of the holy and pure, who shine as a resplendence of the firmament to the soul of Phillip Aronow, who has gone to his eternal home. For charity has been donated in remembrance of his soul. May his place of rest be in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, may the All-Merciful One shelter him with the cover of God's wings forever and bind his soul in the bond of life. Adonai is his heritage. May he rest in his resting place in peace, and let us say, Amen. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hamitzei Menucha Nechona, Al Kanfei Hashchina, B'malot Kedoshim Utehorim, Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim, Et Nishmat Paltiel ben Eliyahu HaKohen Veriva, Shehalach La'olamo, Ba'avor Shenadvu Tzadaka, Ba'ad Hazkarat Nishmato, Began Eden Tehe Menuchato, Lachen Bal HaRachamim Yastirehu Beseter Kenefav La'olamim, Bitzror HaChaim Et Nishmato, Adonai Hu Nachalato, V'yanuach Al Mishkavo B'Shalom, V'nomar, Amen. Please be seated. Our formal time together here at the chapel is drawing to a close. Immediately following our time here, we'll be making our way in processional to Crescent Memorial Park in Pensacola for interment. A few announcements. The family asks that donations in lieu of flowers please be made to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, or to a charity of your choice. Additionally, a note from the family who writes, we hope everyone will come back to our house at 434 Lucroft Road in Haddonfield, 434 Lucroft Road, for lunch after the cemetery. We're not having any formal Shiva, but we will be around all day and evening. So if you can't make it for lunch, we'd love you to drop by later, or tomorrow, or into the weekend. Some of our family will be leaving tonight, but others will be staying into the weekend, and we'd love to visit with you and share with you and remember Phil.